and good afternoon. I am Corinne Edwards, Director of the Office of Educational Supports at the Michigan Department of Education. Welcome to the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series designed to expand educator historical knowledge. Today's presentation is Asian Americans and the United States, the Model Minority Myth. Thank you to Dr. Louie, Professor of Anthropology at Michigan State University and MSU's founding director of the Asian Pacific American Studies program. The Teaching Comprehensive History Initiative was created from the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. Teaching history through diverse viewpoints and highlighting historical movements and moments that have shaped our nation will increase student enthusiasm and engagement for history and civics. We appreciate Dr. Rice's vision and leadership in this work and other work connected to ensuring success, opportunities, welcoming, and belonging for all Michigan's students. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'll now pass it over to Mr. Scott Kinnick, Michigan's social studies consultant, who will usher us into this afternoon's learning session. Scott?
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. I'm Scott Koenig, and I am the social studies consultant for the Michigan Department of Education. We're thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I introduce today's presenters, I want to share a few housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature, and questions will be addressed toward the end of this event, if time is permitting. If we run out of time, we'll do our best to follow up with Q&A through email. Also, if you would like sketches, please be sure to sign in on the sketches link that will be provided in the chat in today's presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the View button at the top right of the Zoom window. Towards the end of today's presentation, a linked survey will be presented to you at the close of the webinar, so please provide us with your feedback. Closed captioning and an American Sign Language interpreter has been provided. If closed captioning isn't automatically visible, select the Show Subtitle option. Your interpreter for today is Marilyn Corlett. Now, joining us today is Dr. Andrea Louie, who is a professor of anthropology. She has conducted research exploring how ideas constructed around Chineseness as a racial and cultural identity have been reworked as transnational processes bring Chinese from different parts of the world into contact with one another. Her book, Chineseness Across Borders, Renegotiating Chinese Identities in China and the US, won the Association for Asian American Studies Social Sciences Book Award in March 2006. Her second book, How Chinese Are You? Adopted Chinese Youth and Their Families Negotiate Identity and Culture, examines the cultural socialization and racialization of children adopted from China in the US. She is currently working on a project on Chinese international students and on a new book project focusing on the multiple narratives surrounding the story of Toi Len-gun, a Chinese immigrant who was selected as U.S. Mother of the Year in 1952. Dr. Louie teaches courses on transnational processes and identities, China, and Asian Americans. She is the founding director of the Asian Pacific America Studies program at MSU. Dr. Louie, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Scott. Sorry, I was having a little bit of trouble unmuting, but now I have the power to do that. So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to MDE for giving me this opportunity to share my story. As you will see, this is something that I do research on, but it's also very much connected to my family history and the research project I'm currently working on. So I hope to integrate all of these together as a way to, teach you some of the concepts, but also humanize the story and ground it in this specific example. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So these discussion questions on this slide were taken from a lesson plan that accompanies the Asian American documentary series that was aired on PBS. Scott, if you could click on that link. Thank you so much. So the questions that I had listed there, actually, Scott, if you wouldn't mind actually going to the discussion questions on the right-hand side there. Oh, okay, they're also there. I just wanted to show people where they were within the lesson. I'm going to try to address these within the context of my presentation and organize a presentation around it. I'm going to start by showing you a video clip from the series. I was actually interviewed for the series because it turns out that my maternal grandmother's story was a central part of the establishment of the model minority myth during the 1950s and in the Cold War. So what you're going to see here is a clip that features my mother, my aunt, and myself, and actually another aunt, although I don't know if she's on screen, gathered around the awards that my grandmother was presented when she was awarded U.S. Mother of the Year in 1952. So we'll play that clip, and then that will provide context for some of the things I'm going to discuss later.
She was very compliant, but she was a little overwhelmed.
She
In
was.
fact, she was never the same after all.
What do you mean?
Well, she always felt she had to live up to the name of being American mother.
Yes.
And I think as her kids, didn't we also feel a bit
Yes.
pressure that way?
Right.
If you look at some of the newsreels, they also focus on the fact that her husband was in the U.S. Army in World War I. The fact that one of her sons was in the Navy. And then her children are in these stereotypical model minority careers, doctor, lawyer, engineer. It fits this narrative of Americanization and assimilation, where Chinese Americans become this quote unquote model minority, these good immigrants living the American dream.
The stereotype of exaggerated Asian American success makes it to the silver screen. But behind the facade, things aren't always what they seem to be.
I'm a child of the 1950s, one in a bazillion growing up in the suburbs of America. There were lots of communities that had covenants that said Blacks, Asians, Latinos, Native Americans could not live there. My parents had been looking for a place to raise their family, and they were told, we can't sell to you Orientals. So they ended up in this mass-produced housing tract, a Levittown. Our Levittown was the third Levittown. The first two were all white, and somehow ours allowed my parents to move in. We were the only Asian family in our New Jersey town. We were the first, and then a number of African-American families moved in too. This was the integration of America. But growing up in the suburbs at a time that was not long after the incarceration of Japanese Americans, World War II, as kids, knowing that we were American, that we grew up eating hot dogs and apple pie, we always knew that there was a difference. If somebody said, go back where you came from, that meant to go back to China, not to Levittown.
People just did not want us in that neighborhood. So one day I was coming home, and this kid grabbed me and says, we don't like Japs. I says, I'm not Jap, I'm a Filipino. I said, Doesn't matter. You're not one of us. There's always that term, you're not one of us.
If you're the model minority, you keep your mouth shut. You never complain. You just, you know, march along, be a good soldier, be that good Asian.
A good Asian American in the 1950s is someone who identifies first as American, and maybe the Asian part is something that you celebrate through occasional cooking, nice exotic clothes that you bring out on festive occasions, but that it is not at all the primary way that you identify yourself. You're probably Christian. You work hard, you believe in America, you are not asking for any handouts, you are not protesting. In fact, you are very, very grateful for everything that the United States has given you and for the opportunity to be in the United States and to achieve the American dream, if not for yourself, then for your children and for your grandchildren. This idea that Asian Americans could become so successful without any government intervention or government help is used not only to delegitimize the real claims of discrimination by African Americans, but also to create a wedge between these two groups.
When Asian Americans overcome adversity, they are celebrated. But when African Americans demand equality, they are vilified. And for those who don't fit the mold of the good American, there's a price to pay.
The bad Asian American would be the critic who's allying themselves with the African Americans and labor organizers and activists and communists, socialists, radicals, and anarchists who threaten the United States and everything the United States stands for.
Okay, thank you. I keep getting a message that says the host is not allowing people to unmute themselves, which is why there was a delay. So sorry about that. That clip has a lot to unpack, and throughout this presentation, I hope to be providing some more context about this. The model minority idea is contradictory in many ways, right? Because what's wrong with being good, right? What's wrong with being seen as good or trying to be good, right? And as is hinted at in the video, there are a lot of implications for how Asian Americans are positioned in relation to other minority groups. And also, what this image allows Asian Americans to do and not to do. And also this idea that Asian Americans shouldn't need help, that they should be able to lift themselves up by their own bootstraps, which is actually a narrative that a lot of people in my own family have because of the legacy of my grandmother's story of, as I'll get into in a minute, she was a widow and she was able to continue running the laundry with the help of her 8 children. And the family emphasizes that she never took welfare, right? So that kind of sets up this idea of deserving versus undeserving immigrants, and a lot of other issues as well. But the discussion questions that you see here that are taken from that lesson plan touch upon these issues, right? What does it mean to be seen as good? Is Americanizing a good thing, assimilating to American society? How might some of the stereotypes associated with the model minority be problematic, in particular in relation to building connections to other groups, particularly other minorities? Next slide, please. So just to sort of list the characteristics, the model minority myth. And so we almost always use the term myth to discuss model minority. It's not something that people believe, that Asian American scholars believe is actually true, even though we also acknowledge that many Asian Americans are quite invested in this idea. So being a model minority means that being successful both in education and work, so good, success in education leading to success in work, being intelligent, hardworking, not causing trouble, and being polite and law-abiding. Most of these were covered by Erica Lee, who was the last speaker in that video clip that we just saw, who just moved to Harvard. She just was hired by Harvard as an Asian American and immigration historian. The photo on the right that you see here is my grandmother meeting Bess Truman, which was obviously an amazing moment for her, but as I'll talk about a little bit later, also caused her great stress. My grandmother could not speak English fluently at all, and being in the public spotlight created a lot of long-standing health issues for her. So another thing that I'm going to be pointing out throughout this presentation is there's this flip side, or this, I think, cost to being or to living up to this model minority image. And that's something that the beginning of the clip alluded to as well. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is a picture on the right of me in the Guangzhou Overseas Chinese Museum in 2017. I was in Hong Kong for a conference. I visited relatives in Guangzhou. They brought me to this new museum. And as I was walking around, there was a section on workers in the United States. And I saw this picture of my grandmother. This was one of the press photos that was used, along with the announcement of her award as U.S. Mother of the Year. And the funny thing is, the label just says that she was a laundry worker. So, I don't know how they obtained it. They didn't have the full context of it. And she was a laundry worker. And that indeed was the basis for her award, right? The fact that she was a homemaker who managed to continue also running this business with the help of her 8 kids after her husband, who was a World War I veteran, passed away. But for me, this was a really interesting moment to see this image used out of context across the ocean, but actually not far from where she emigrated from in China. So I grew up with this story. I grew up with a particular version of the story. So one of the things that I'm working on in this research project, this book that I'm writing, is thinking about the different ways that her story has been told and retold by the family, by the media, by scholars, and in her own words. So I'll be talking later about an interview that I did with her when she was 100 years old. This was in 1992, where she talks about her life story as well. But I highlight this idea of the American dream because I think that's how the family thinks about her story. And clearly, if you think about her coming from China, not knowing how to read or write, her family, being very vulnerable to starvation. She actually was raised by a foster family because her family couldn't afford to raise her. But she wasn't sold or given to the family. She was asked by her mother to, basically the arrangement is that she would work for that family and they would raise her, but the mother would determine who she could marry. And then, after my grandfather died, she raised these children who became a doctor, lawyer, engineer. And so that looks like the American dream in many ways. And that's actually one of the vocabulary words associated with the lesson. But one of the important things to think about is, what is the American dream? Is it attainable for everybody? What are some of the challenges and barriers to some people achieving this American dream? And I guess how can the American dream in some ways lead people to believe that if they work hard enough, then they can succeed, and it's all sort of based on individual merit and individual hard work. Next slide, please. So these, this slide, the left half and the right half complement one another. And this is an exercise in looking at an individual within this broader historical context. And this is not, the historical context isn't something that I really thought about until I went to college and graduate school and started learning more about the history of Asians in the United States and the various challenges that they face. So we know that she came as the wife of a U.S. Citizen and World War I veteran, my grandfather Dogen Gun. We know that she engaged in laundry work, which was an occupation that was quite common for many Chinese immigrants. We know that my grandfather passed away when my mother, who's the youngest, was only 6 years old, the youngest of the 8 children. And prior to that, my grandfather had his leg amputated and was unable to work, so that she really had to take the reins and in terms of running the household and the laundry. Those spaces were very integrated as well. My grandfather also had problems with gambling and opium addiction, which was not uncommon. I'll hopefully get to that in a minute as well. She worked extremely long days, and one of the most poignant quotes that she shared during her interview when she was 100 years old was she talked about one lifetime is like other people's working for. And I think she was referring to her hard work in China, but also her hard work in the United States. So this, success that she was very proud of, that her children had achieved, was the result, of her hard work and her children's hard work. Once my grandfather died, everybody had to pitch in. The oldest son had to take 2 years off of high school. So, that is kind of a neat story, or kind of a neat package of a story there. But I think it's really important to point out the historical context. And we can do this with my grandmother's story. We can do this with the stories of many Chinese immigrants. And there are resources online that give us stories of a number of different Chinese immigrants that you could potentially use in your classes. So one of the big aspects of the historical context are the Chinese exclusion laws, which were in effect from 1882 until 1943. So the Chinese were basically the first group, racialized group, or national origins group, to be legally excluded from naturalization to U.S. citizenship, and for some classes for entry into the U.S. Between 1882 and 1943. And so my grandfather actually entered the United States illegally during Chinese exclusion, because he was not the son of a citizen. He, like many Chinese, came in. He came in over the Canadian border. I think through, probably went to Vancouver, took the train across to Montreal, and then came in through the border there. He was rounded up by a Chinese inspector. They'd sent someone to interview him in his laundry, found that he didn't have documentation, was put on trial before a commissioner. And in this trial, he claimed that he was born in the United States. And this relates back to the previous webinar from last week that Dr. Wake and I did on citizenship. So the only way that a Chinese could be a citizen was to have been born on US soil, or to have been, to be the son of someone who was born on US soil. So he made that claim, even though it wasn't true. He also agreed to fight in World War I, and the commissioner found him not guilty of being in the US illegally. So Chinese exclusion shaped the experiences of many Chinese, of all Chinese immigrants. Laundry work was an occupation that Chinese workers could fill, because it was something that was, filling this niche in the United States, didn't require fluency in English. So it's not a coincidence that you see many Chinese immigrants doing laundry or restaurant work, right? In these kind of segregated occupations. The larger history of transnational migration from Taishan, China, which was where my grandmother was from, to the United States, is also something that informs this story. So this was a region of China that was affected by political unrest, environmental disasters, and a lot of other factors that caused men to go abroad to seek a living, to be able to send remittances back to China. But they never planned to stay in the United States, and they couldn't, right? Because of the Chinese exclusion laws and other laws excluding the entry of women. It was very hard to form families until after World War II. And I think to some extent prior to that, when women were able to come over and through different means. So my family's history on both sides, actually, both sides had laundries, was part of this transnational migration pattern. And most early Chinese immigrants followed that pattern, where they would come to the US to work and eventually retire in China. It was only more recently that families were able to come over, or certain circumstances like with my grandmother, where my grandfather basically had a commissioner rule in his favor, and then he was able to go back to bring her over. A little bit about the Mother of the Year award. So the American Mothers Committee was part of the JCPenney Golden Rule Foundation, and her being selected as Mother of the Year in 1952 was not a coincidence. This is not to say that she wasn't deserving, right? I mean, I'm proud of the family history and how hard she worked, but historian Cho Ling-Ye talks about how the American Mothers Committee was trying to diversify who was selected as this ideal mother in the form of US Mother of the Year. And in her article, she talks about how government agencies use the mass media to create a Cold War consensus that basically was designed to counter accusations that the US was not the democracy it claimed to be, right? And not the leader of the free world that it was trying to be in this Cold War context, right? So the US was, saying that it's the leader of the free world, that there was equal opportunity for everybody there. And foreign powers were saying, well, what about this racial inequality that we're seeing? And so it's very clear from Cho Ling-Ye's article that her selection as US Mother of the Year was not an accident, that it was designed to, in part, to send a message globally about how the US was a place where a Chinese woman and her children could flourish. And in the following slides, I'll be showing you more details along those lines. So yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so part of what was happening was here were changes in how Chinese families and Chinese women were viewed after World War II. So the title of this slide is a little bit of a mouthful: Becoming Good Immigrants, Changing Views Toward Women, Chinese Immigrants, and Mothers. So there were a few things happening after World War II. One was that in the context of the Cold War, mothering, domesticity, or kind of strengthening the domestic sphere became key to this idea of the containment of communism. So there are a number of historians who have written about this. I'm an anthropologist, but I have learned more about the historical literature and working on this project. So one of these books is called Not June Cleaver, which you see in the third bullet point. And one of the interesting points that Not June Cleaver makes is that this model of this domestic housewife that was part of, that was strengthening the domestic sphere as a defense against communism was not possible for all women, including women of color. And my grandmother would have fit into that, that category, right? She was not just a homemaker, she was a businesswoman. And I think because she worked in a laundry and the laundry space was integrated into the household space, so they would study and eat downstairs where the laundry was, and just basically go upstairs to their 2-bedroom apartment to sleep, because there were a lot of kids. There were 8 kids, right? So there wasn't really room for everyone to hang out upstairs. This was this type of work, and the work of many other women, was made invisible by this idea of domesticity and containment, in the form of motherhood and women. Another thing that happened after World War II was you see changing ideas or changing images of Chinese and Japanese Americans, more sympathetic views, more understandings of them as being families who are integrated into the mainstream US. So one of the main works by Ellen Wu, and I have a quote from her later, basically talks about this key shift in how Chinese and Japanese Americans were seen. So I'll be talking about that more later in the presentation. The other thing that I wanted to bring up was this idea of assimilation or Americanization. So my grandmother was nominated for US Mother of the Year by a very kind woman named Clara Soule. Clara Soule was a retired school teacher in the Portland, Maine public school system. She was also an Americanization teacher. So the Americanization movement basically advocated for the idea that immigrants could become part of US society by learning English. And it was actually a positive view toward immigration, right? The idea that the diversity of immigrants could contribute to American society, that immigrants should be allowed in. So Clara Soule held English classes for Chinese restaurant workers, Chinese laundrymen. She also did this for other populations in the Portland, Maine area. She would also, when a new Chinese family would move into the area, come visit them, and in the case of my grandmother and many other Chinese women in the area, offered to teach them English. So there was this long and complicated dynamic between my grandmother and Ms. Soule, because my grandmother, of course, was working very hard, working those 16-hour days, and Clara Soule thought that she should really learn English. She should become a Christian, and in Clara Soule's mind, that would lead to her assimilation and success. And my grandmother just didn't have the time to do some of these things. But the other thing that Clara Soule did was, as a member of the Portland Business Women's Association, help get my grandmother nominated as Maine Mother of the Year. And she was very familiar with the story and the struggle she had overcome. And she was behind that nomination. She wrote the nomination letter for my grandmother. But her overall vision, right, was about inclusivity and Americanization of all immigrants. Can we have the next slide, please? So there's a lot of text on this slide, but I wanted to show you what this article looked like. This was an editorial written by May Craig, who was Washington correspondent for the Portland Press Herald. It was published, there were a couple of them that came out in May 1952, right after she was awarded US Mother of the Year. May Craig, like many others involved in bringing my grandmother's story to Washington, was very aware of the political implications of this story. So, it's not just sort of my own sense that this is part of the Cold War propaganda, but this is very evident in the way it was written about by May Craig and others, including Congressman Hale, whose idea it was to bring my grandmother to Washington, D.C. to meet Bess Truman. So the bigger context for this is China had become communist in 1949 when Chairman Mao took power. The Asia was a strategic spot in, the Cold area and the Cold War, kind of the struggle for control of Asia, right? So there was concern about getting a message across to Asia about what a great place the US was for immigrants, particularly Asian immigrants. And Chinese Americans were seen as a proxy for China. So even though my grandmother never was able to go back to China, she her story were used, right, as a way to talk about the position of Chinese immigrants in US society. So a couple of excerpted quotes from the editorials were Congressman Hale of Maine struck a blow in the Cold War for Asia and bringing Ms. Goon to Washington, D.C. for a visit with Ms. Truman and meeting with the Chinese ambassador, Chinese meaning Taiwan at this time, noting that the Japanese and other foreign correspondents would be given the story. And the second excerpt, all over the world, the communists are telling the hordes of non-white people that Americans are hypocrites, that they do not mean what they say about democracy. They picture all non-whites as downtrodden, scorned, and mistreated in the United States. Yeah, if we could go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about sort of the context for this. So I had mentioned before that Ellen Wu's research was significant in tracing the origins of the model minority myth back to the Cold War. Originally, people talked about it as starting in the 1960s after immigration laws changed, allowing for occupational preferences and therefore having more doctors and engineers and other professionals coming in. But Ellen Wu traces this shift back to the 1940s and the 1950s, kind of accompanying the shift I talked before in looking at Asian Americans as being part of families. So she talks about this going from seeing Chinese and Japanese as unassimilable aliens unfit for membership in the nation, in other words, as definitively non-white, to and being systemically excluded from participation in the nation, to being seen as definitively non-Black. So, and she points out how this fits in with the United States' geopolitical ambitions, right, to become a leader of the free world. So the shift from non-white to non-Black, happened over time through a variety of means, but it very clearly, there's clear evidence of this in the historical record. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to make sure I'm able to get through everything, so I'm going to try to speed up a little bit here. There are a lot of points to make here, right? My grandmother's story certainly fits this model minority idea, and it was used to help create this image, this idea. But what I found out through my research was, and just through other sources, is that clearly, right, even though she was seen as this exemplary American, there continues to be racism and discrimination against Asian Americans. So for Asian Americans, a common theme is, this kind of marginal inclusion, or this inclusion accompanying exclusion. And this is, I think, oftentimes covered up by the idea of Asian Americans being model minorities. I already talked about how the fact that she was, her business could kind of be subsumed under this idea of homemaker, made that part of her labor invisible. which I think is not doing full justice to her whole story. There are a lot of aspects to her story that weren't portrayed in the media or in the common version of the story that's told by the family. So I don't have time to go into it a great deal here, but this interview that I did with her when she was 100 years old, I don't speak the dialect, unfortunately, that she speaks. So I had my mother and my aunt translate, and I realized, I knew this, from the moment I did the interview, that they didn't translate everything. But the summer before last, I was fortunate to have a friend and colleague of mine who is a linguist specializing in the dialect that my grandmother spoke, fully translate the interview for me. And to me, it really brought out her voice, right? And this colleague was able to show instances where she was asserting agency and a lot of other really interesting things about the interview. But there were a lot of things that she had to say about my grandfather related to his gambling problems and whatnot that weren't translated. So there were, I think, a lot of things that, and she refers to like dramatic things that she can't even talk about, right, in this interview, that she doesn't even talk about in the interview to my mother or my aunt. She also ended up looking at the fourth bullet point with kind of long-term issues with nerves. And she would use the term nerva, which is, based on the English word, to talk about being nervous. I'm not sure she actually used it, during those festivities, but, she had trouble sleeping. She had to take medicine, right, to calm her nerves because of that pressure, that sense of responsibility she felt after having been selected as U.S. Mother of the Year. She felt like she had to represent all Chinese people to some extent, because of that title. I already talked about the racial wedge issue, and I have a slide on that further, but I just wanted to say that because she was a single mother, but not an unwed mother, because she was not, she was in between white and Black, that positioned her to be used to talk about race in different ways in the United States. Something that's very powerful for me in her story is that the moment where she was recognized as this exemplary American, she actually wasn't a US citizen yet at that point, was also this moment where she was cut off from connection to her relatives in China with the communists taking power. She was able to send money back, but she was never able to return herself. And I don't know if she'd even hoped to, but I think that, just the fact that she was not able to even have the possibility of return was, this kind of irony about this historical moment. So next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about the consequences of the model minority myth today. So this is something that scholars of Asian American studies highlight. These are things that they highlight about the, the sort of, going back to one of my original questions, what's wrong with being a good minority? So it hides the historical context of Asian immigration to the US, including the context of exclusion that I talked about before, that shaped Asian immigrants' lives in many ways. It covers up the diversity in the Asian American community, and I have a slide on that later to talk about not only socioeconomic diversity, but also ethnic and religious and other types of diversity. It makes Asian Americans less eligible or willing to seek support from social programs or to ask for assistance. And I think sometimes if they ask for assistance, it makes them less likely to get the assistance, because the idea is that, they're doing great and why would they need help? This model minority myth is very powerful. Also, it can serve to hide racism, discrimination that they clearly are facing. I mean, it's come to light more recently with the rise in anti-Asian hate, but this is something, anti-Asian hate has been here all along. Asian Americans often have to, hide different parts of themselves, as Erica Lee talked about, in order to try to fit in. The idea that there's a racial wedge, that Asian Americans are used to say to other minorities, look how successful these Asian Americans are. They came over with nothing. Why can't you be like them, right? Why can't you be good minorities like them? Why can't you be trouble-free? I think that's an extremely dangerous, and perhaps the most dangerous part of this myth is the way it's used in public discourse as a way to shame other minorities, to say, Asian Americans work hard, they don't cause trouble, and it pays off for them. And, there's something wrong with you because you're not doing those things, essentially is how this myth is often used. Next slide, please. Okay, so there have been a number of efforts to educate people about the consequences of the model minority myth. So on the right-hand side, you see one of the original articles that was used to kind of highlight Asian Americans as model minorities. This was, I think, in the 60s. And then this hashtag remodel minority is a campaign to speak back to this idea of Asian Americans being model minorities. On the left side, I wanted to highlight research that was done by actually one of my colleagues at Michigan State University, Dr. Chin. She did work in the New York City school system, and she's done a lot of additional work, but she talks about this achievement adjustment paradox. And basically what she highlights through her research is that in addition to perhaps high test scores and some other measures that might indicate that Asian Americans are doing well, you also see high rates of depression and anxiety, low self-esteem, issues with family that stem from differences in language between parents and children, pressure from high expectations, discrimination from peers based on language differences, physical size, and this idea of model minority myth, causing this wedge. And she talks about how this peer discrimination was exacerbated by the model minority myth of the Chinese American students maintained by teachers within these schools. So at this moment, I don't have practical advice for teachers, except for, hopefully you'll become aware that this idea of Asian Americans being model minorities is potentially problematic, and, to try to, I guess, be thoughtful about jumping to conclusions or assumptions about your Asian American students. There are a lot of resources out there also that that help kind of complicate this idea of Asian Americans as model minorities that that are out there that you can access. And I'll see if I can add some to the list that I already have. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about, again, the current context of anti-Asian hate. Unfortunately, this is something that, as I said, has never really gone away. And I think it's important to also understand how it's not just a product of COVID and not just a product of xenophobia that we've seen more recently. So this quote is from 18 Million Rising. It's an online resources. They produce a zine called Unmasking Yellow Peril. So the screenshot on the right is taken from that, and it combines different images, but the one in the center in black and white is from Angel Island, which was the detention center for Asian immigrants in San Francisco Bay. And you can see the dehumanization of these Chinese immigrants being physically inspected. And this was even before the process of interrogation, where they were ruled to be the sons of citizens, or to be potentially lying about this. the quote says, what we're experiencing in 2020 is tied to the violence in the mid 1800s when Chinese immigrants were targeted while risking their lives to lay railroad tracks. As a result of white suspicion and fear, the US passed racial bans on immigration and naturalization in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. A lot of this was talked about in the presentation last week, but anti-Asian, anti-Chinese discrimination and violence, right, is part of the structure of racism in the United States, unfortunately. Next slide, please. Another stereotype that kind of goes hand in hand with the idea of the yellow peril and model minority myth is the perpetual foreigner. So the idea that Asian Americans can never be seen as unquestionably American. With my students, I do something called an identity exercise when I ask them to write down just for themselves whether they think they have culture, whether they call themselves a something American. And the whole point of this essay is, of this exercise is to get students to think about how not everybody has the option to call themselves just plain American, right? And that's what this quote speaks to as well. So a few examples, in addition to Japanese incarceration during World War II, we see the murder of Vincent Chin, which Dr. Wake will talk about in the seminar next week. I believe it's next week. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American draftsman living in Highland Park, Michigan. He was murdered after his bachelor party. He was confronted during his bachelor party, and they basically hunted him down and beat him with a baseball bat, and he never recovered consciousness, and they never faced any consequences. But this related to their association of Vincent Chin with the Japanese auto industry, and these men were laid off auto workers, and it didn't really matter if he was Chinese or Japanese. They were taking it out on him because he was Asian. So for a lot of Asian Americans, this brought a new type of racial consciousness and activism to the community. It's unfortunate that this happened in Michigan, but it got national and international attention. And I have linked in the resource slide. It was just recently the 40th, I think, anniversary of his murder. There were a series of events this summer, so there are resources for that in at this on the slide at the end. Muslim Americans after 9/11 similarly targeted as perpetual foreigners, and then of course we see with COVID this twin pandemic of anti-Asian hate and the actual virus itself. Next slide, please. So this is another campaign. There have been many educational campaigns saying my ethnicity is not a virus. So Asian Americans have tried to be outspoken about this, but at the same time, there are online trackers that show the number of anti-Asian hate incidents that have occurred since COVID started. So one of them is called Stop AAPI Hate, but there are many others that you can refer to look at the sheer numbers. Okay, sorry, I'm just checking this message. Yeah, so, okay, next slide, please. So if I'm understanding the message correctly, I can go on for another second, possibly. So this is taken from the Pew Research Center, and there are a lot of resources out there, again, linked in the resources that show, thank you, Renee, the diversity of the Asian American population. I think the model minority myth covers up the fact that Asian Americans are an incredibly diverse group in terms of not only national origins, but also socioeconomic status. So the Pew Report has a lot of different graphics you can use to illustrate this. But if you look at the variation in income, the average looks fairly high, but there's quite a bit of variation within that. And also the same for poverty rates, right? They affect different groups of Asian Americans and also within these different ethnic groups quite differently. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is a little bit of a heavy topic. One of the events that I think shocked the Asian American community occurred with the Atlanta murders in March 2021. Of course, we knew about the rise in Asian American hate incidents. A lot of them were random attacks, or not so random, but surprise attacks on elderly Asian Americans, you know, in urban areas. But this was on a different level. So on March 16th, a white man shot and killed 4 people. 3 of them were women, 2 of Asian descent, in one location in Georgia, and then drove to Atlanta and shot and killed 3 more women at a spa, Asian American women, and then killed more women across the street. All of these women were of Asian descent. And the issue with the public discourse around this was that people said, oh, it's mental illness, it's a gun control issue and things like that. But it was very clear, and I don't have time to go into all the details here, that this was targeted, and this was targeting Asian women, right? Even just looking at, you know, who was murdered, right? It makes it very clear. And then in the aftermath of this, we see that Asian American women, there's a very high rate of experiencing racism and discrimination. And that 51% of Asian women say they feel less safe today than at the start of the pandemic. So, you know, I'm sharing this slide to emphasize how relevant and real anti-Asian hate is. Some of your students may be experiencing this, or their families may be facing it. And just as a sort of flip side of the model minority myth, right? It's really important to recognize that the community, that many Asian Americans are in distress because of this overall climate. Next slide, please. And so I'm not going to go into this in great depth, and I have a link to the full presentation. This is not my slide. This is from Dr. Jennifer Ho, but she does a really good job of providing a number of resources connecting anti-Asian racism and COVID-19. And in this slide, she connects anti-Asian racism, right, to other forms of racism in the United States, including the transatlantic slave trade, American Indian dispossession of land, Japanese American incarceration, Latinx populations being targeted at the borders, and other forms of systemic discrimination in the United States that often map onto race, as well as socioeconomic status. So there's a link to that in the resources slide, and I think that's the final slide. The next slide here is pretty much all the resources I mentioned. There might be a couple in there that I don't have, but I'm happy to share those later. So yeah, that's the last slide. So I don't think there are time for questions, but I will let Scott take over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Louie. This was absolutely amazing content, sharing a history that is so important to be sharing within our classrooms, and as well as giving us a perspective that many of us have not had the opportunity to learn through. So this has been absolutely amazing. We thank you, Dr. Louie, for this. Thanks for sharing your specific knowledge, your content, your resources with us. This is very helpful in teaching comprehensive history within our classrooms. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Please make sure there'll be a survey at the end, so please complete that for us. It will also come to your emails that you've shared with us in your registration. And also, please make sure you grab the sketches link. We'll do our best here to get it in the chat, of course, before we close out. Our next session in Teaching Comprehensive History series will continue on September 28th from 4 to 5 p.m. Please register for this event. If you haven't already, share with your friends and colleagues to come join the event. We invite everyone to come join this webinar community as we learn together. Once again, thank you all for joining us in today's event. We look forward to seeing you next week on the 28th. Have a great rest of your day.